And we're live with Angular Error. My name is Kent C. Dodds, and with me are a couple awesome developers, and we're going to be talking about Angular internals with our guest, Tero Parviainen. Oh man, I just get nervous. So yeah, there's Tero. And then, yeah, I just barely practiced his name again, and I just can't get it. So I'm sorry, Tero. But he's the author of NG Book or not NG Book. Sorry, that's
another one.
Yeah, totally different entirely. No, Tero is the author of Build Your Own Angular, and so he knows a thing or two about the internals of Angular, and so we're going to learn and talk about some cool stuff. And then we also have our panelists, Amy Knight and Pascal Precht.
Hello.
And Olivier Combe.
Hi.
And Olivier is wearing an awesome shirt.
Yep.
So that's,
you too.
Yep, I am too. This is from the Teespring campaign that ended about 2 weeks ago. And yeah, as a pre-pick before the end of the show, I'll just pick Teespring because that was like a totally awesome experience. It took me like 10 minutes to set up the campaign, and then I didn't have to think about it except being super excited. So yeah, anyway, there are 9 people in the world with these very rare T-shirts. So hopefully I'm planning on doing another campaign for the Angular Error T-shirts. I'm actually also doing stickers on Sticker Mule, hopefully really soon. So yeah, look out for that. Before we get started, some additional announcements. So next week's show is June 9th, same time, same place, with Jonathan Turner on Angular with TypeScript. So Jonathan Turner is the TypeScript team lead or project manager or something. He's awesome. He spoke at NGConf about TypeScript. And we may have 1 or 2 developers from the TypeScript team on that show as well. And as always, follow us on Twitter and Google+. To keep up to date with the latest stuff. And actually, if you go to follow.angular-air.com, you will be taken to our Twitter. So, woohoo! Okay, so let's go ahead and get started into the stuff that actually everybody's interested in hearing about. So, Tero, why don't you talk to us about who you are, where you work, what you do, and then we can go into your book.
Right, so yeah, I'm Tero Parviainen, a sort of independent software consultant from Helsinki. I've been doing programming professionally for about a decade, or actually more by now. For the past, say, 2 or 3 years, pretty much front-end exclusively, and a couple of years ago got kind of heavily into Angular, and have been kind of on that path since. I also, when I first started learning Angular, I found it quite difficult, which is why I started to learn the internals as well, because that's what I usually do when something feels too difficult for me. And that's probably what has brought me to this show here.
Wow, that's awesome. So if I could respond like that to something that's difficult, then that would be a good thing. But normally it's just like, this is really hard. I'm going to go do something else.
Well, yeah, that's what I do with most things. But when you're sort of bought into the idea of that it's probably very good, you just don't understand it yet, then it's something you probably want to invest in.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's really cool that you shared your learnings with the world with Build Your Own Angular. Can you talk about that book a little bit?
Sure. So the book Build Your Own Angular is a book I'm writing and self-publishing, which is all about sort of reverse engineering AngularJS and writing your own sort of version of it from first principles, from nothing, essentially, from just JavaScript and some Lodash. And it's a very kind of methodical approach to learning the framework by doing test-driven development, writing failing tests for the next little feature you want to add to it, and then writing enough code to make that test pass, and doing that hundreds of times over, and in that process coming up with a version of Angular that you don't actually need, but that helps you understand what's going on in the real Angular framework. And I'm almost done with the book. It's a 6-month project I started 18 months ago. I'm almost done by now. It's coming up to I think 1,000 pages or something. It's much bigger than I anticipated, but it's been fun, and I think people have also gotten value out of it. So it's a nice project to have been involved in.
That's awesome. So it's totally a test-driven development book.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So out of curiosity, how many tests are in that book? Do you know?
I haven't counted, but it's some hundreds probably.
Plenty.
Actually, of the actual text of the book, test code is probably it's a lot more than the actual production code at least, but it's I think even more than the prose in the book, because it takes a lot of setup often to test things, and the tests are really where you kind of figure out how it should work, because that's where you sort of have the external effects of what you're writing kind of written down. It's the same thing as happens when you do TDD with any project.
Yeah, I find that it's interesting you say that there are more tests than prose in the book, because I find that like with Angular formally and the developer of that project, for a long time when people would ask questions on the GitHub issues, I would just try to use words to explain how things were working, or how to do something properly. But I started to make JS bin as an example. Like, this is how you do it, accomplish what you're trying to do, and like that was like far and away much easier to do for them to understand and for me to illustrate my point, to use those examples. So that's consistent with my experience. So
Great, yeah, programmers understand code really well.
That's right. Tero, can you tell us like how you started? Like, so when you take a framework like AngularJS, there are like a lot of concepts, and is there like did you start with a kind of structure, which topics you want to cover first, or I don't know, like maybe you jumped right into the compiler stuff, or like what was your kind of approach to write that book?
Well, it's sort of because in the framework, kind of one thing builds on another, so I needed to start with the things that everything else pretty much depends on, which with Angular seem to be the scopes, the watches and digest and things like that, the change detection mechanism essentially. That's what I started, but also I started with that because it was what felt to me kind of the most magical thing about Angular, the thing that when you don't understand it, it feels like, how could anything like this work? And so I wanted to sort of demystify that first, and it actually started with an article. I wasn't writing a book to begin with. I wrote an article about watches and how they work. And based on the response I got to that, I started with the book, and after that it's been kind of based on what depends on other things, and taking just the order from that. It's sort of, you can't do like templates, for example, without doing HTTP first and things like that. There are dependencies that affects the order in which I write these things.
Cool. Yeah, that's actually super interesting. So when I think it's kind of like the same thing when you give trainings or when you do workshops on Angular, especially when the framework comes with testability in mind, and you actually should embrace testing.
Yeah.
It's kind of tricky to find out where to start. Like, you need this starting point to get something done, but at the same time you want to start as early as possible with testing. And I think writing a book about that stuff is kind of the same thing. You have to think about which part of the framework can you start with, so that it makes sense, and that maybe you don't have to necessarily test it in the first place. I don't know, but I can imagine that this is kind of tricky.
It is tricky when you're training or when you're writing, like when you have to kind of minimize the amount of forward references you make. Like there is this concept, you don't understand it yet, but just ignore it for now. Like, you don't want to have to say that too much, because each time the people learning it have to kind of put that away in their brain, like there's this thing that I have to remember to pick up later, which I don't understand yet. And it's tricky to find the order of things and still make it interesting without kind of having to spend the first day of training on mundane little details that don't end up to anything interesting. There's a balance, I think, there somewhere.
I kind of had a question building on what Pascal said. So sometimes when you're learning something new, you're kind of told, especially like I'm a somewhat newer developer, you know, to kind of like take things at face value, that the other pieces you'll kind of put together later on. And it's always kind of like hard to gauge when you're teaching yourself something new, when to not go down a rabbit hole and when to go down that rabbit hole. So I'm curious like how you were able to gauge like when to go deep and when not to, because I really love the idea of what you did. I've used that approach for learning other frameworks, like literally reinventing exactly what they did because I felt that that was a valuable way to learn. But you know, sometimes people don't agree with that, or you know, or sometimes it's hard to know where the line is.
Yeah, there's definitely sort of a balance there, like because we don't have time to invest this kind of do this learning approach with everything that we use because there's just too many things. But with Angular, it looked to me like, based on what I was hearing from other developers and customers, that it's going to be around for a long time, that it's going to be something I probably use for a long time, and it felt difficult enough that I couldn't sort of pick it up on a level I need to by just doing the normal thing, which is reading tutorials and things like that. Because it happened to me before, like I spent maybe 5 or 6 years doing active Rails development, and never during that time I fully figured out much of that framework. Like there was always this magic involved where I don't understand what it's really doing when I call this method or something. And that made it just unpleasant to use where when things don't expect as things don't behave as I expect them to, there's always...
That's actually exactly what I was referring to, was in Rails.
Right.
I had...
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yes, I was tired of like just doing gem install and trusting exactly what it was doing, so I decided to like build my own engine so I could understand what these were doing.
Right, yeah, so it sounds very much like what I did, yeah. So yeah, with Rails and frameworks in general, like any kind of bigger technologies, there's just so much that when you don't understand them, it makes you go more slowly, and it's just not pleasant to work with something that feels magical, and you end up with like a lot of superstitious code, basically, where I kind of probably have to call this method and do these things in this order. I don't exactly know why, but this other person is doing it, so I probably have to do it as well. And then there's all this kind of craft you end up with when you don't know exactly what you're doing. So with any technology like that that's big enough and complex enough, I think it makes sense to at least try to do some of exploration of the internals.
You just made me think of scope.apply.
Right.
That's a perfect example. And there are a lot, like the bigger the framework is, the more magic you just wind up relying on, and the more you copy paste from Stack Overflow.
Exactly. And it's not magic. It's not magic when you just look at the code. Like people often have this tendency to not treat the kind of libraries and frameworks as a black box. So you have this JavaScript application where there's your code, and then there's all these libraries, and you only understand your own code, and the rest is kind of magic. And it often turns out when you actually go and look into those libraries and frameworks, it's just more code, like similar code as the one that you're writing. So there's nothing special in it. And when you're using it a lot, it makes sense to try to look at what's going on there. So for example, when you use Angular, during development, use the non-minified version of it, and just step into it in your debugger, or just put console log statements in there, because then you can kind of start to understand what's going on that side of the code, where your code ends and someone else's code begins.
What I like about Angular is that on the doc website you have these links to the source code of what you're reading. And lately, I've been clicking on this more and more, and I've been learning a lot just by comparing what they do, and especially for directives, for example. When I try to do something and I think, oh, this is maybe almost like ng include. Let's see how they do it, and you learn stuff that isn't even documented. And
definitely,
yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, so with directives, it's more so than with anything else, because that API is just so huge, and everyone has their own style of using it, and one of them is how the core team uses it, and that's probably not a bad example to look at.
What I found interesting was that the other day, it's like, I don't know, it's quite long ago, where I saw this tweet from Vojta, and he said something like, okay, so the compiler code of Angular is like the most complicated code he has ever seen. So, and that was the tweet that basically kept me away from digging into that stuff, because I thought, okay, so when he thinks it's like super complicated, how should I ever dig it? So I never really digged into it.
Yeah, it's scary.
Boy, if that compiler code is so confusing, then I'm super freaked, because I've stepped through the digest loop a couple times, and like to me that's pretty complex too. Yeah. Like they're using labels in their for loops and like all kinds of jumping all over the place. It's creepy, but it's amazing.
But then you have like people like Tero who came up with compiler talks at conferences that make things so clear all of a sudden.
Yeah, the trick about that is to ignore 90% of what's going on in there and focus on one thing. Because, for example, compile.js, it's a huge amount of features in that file. It's like 1,000 lines of code and 100 functions, and it so obviously wasn't designed to do all those things that it's currently doing. That makes it like really, really complicated to try to figure out. And what you need to do is, when you are trying to learn how to say just the core compilation works, is just learn to ignore most of the code. Like say there's an if directive.transclude somewhere, followed by 1,000 lines of code, or maybe not 1,000, but 200 lines of code. You skip that part because you're not interested in transclusion, and that's how I did it. It took me a long time, but I think I pretty much understand most of it now. Just in time for it to go away with Angular 2 now.
Nice, perfect. Actually, I want to get into Angular 2, but I'm not. That would be such a good segue. But there are a couple other things that I want to talk about before we get into Angular 2. And looks like Scott Moss just joined us. Hey there, Scott.
Hey, Scott.
So the next question that we thought about asking, I think this is a great one. And I don't know who wrote this down, so I'm just going to ask it myself, I guess. But how is studying the Angular source code helpful, and how do you get started studying the source?
Well, I wouldn't recommend studying the source code to anybody who didn't already know how to use it very well to begin with. That way you need something to reference. If you just jump right into it, like, you're going to be like, what in the fuck is this? So definitely, like, you should have some experience of using a lot of this stuff before. So with that being said, to get started, what I did was I started with the thing that didn't make any sense to me at all at first, and that was like scope stuff. I always want to know how that stuff automatically gets bound and creates watchers and stuff. So I started with that, and it's just a rabbit hole after that. And then that just leads you down this branch of things that you have to figure out. And then that's pretty much what I did. I always just started with something to reference. And I did it straight on GitHub. I didn't even pull the repo down. I was just like on GitHub going through this stuff and the comments and stuff. And then like I hit up somebody who was part of the team, like, yo, I have no idea what the hell this is doing. Like, I need you to tell me what's going on here. And then like I just didn't stop until I heard back. So that's what I did. And as far as like helping me, man, it's just like anything. You first learn how to use it. So I mean, now you can get paid to do it because you know how to use it. And then if you know how it works, then you can develop opinions, right? And anybody with opinions is awesome, right? So like once you start developing opinions about this thing, now you look like a badass. So I mean, it'll just help you solidify your understanding, help you be a lot more faster, and obviously help you like debug a lot easier too.
And talk at conference.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not definitely the first thing you should do with a framework is to go to the source code, because you have to kind of use it first, because then you can connect the code into what's actually going on. And but yeah, as we talked about earlier, it does help when you're just developing with it to have a mental model of what's going on the other side of that API barrier. Right, actually, when you call a method or when something happens, what's going on in that part that you didn't write, because that you don't have to go by the external behavior in that case.
Yeah, I found that the most benefit I've had with going through Angular source code has actually just been in the debugger. Like, you put a debugger statement right before you call scope.apply, and then just follow it through and see what happens. There are some places like compiling a directive, like where do you put a debugger there? But like, it can be really, really helpful to figure out how the framework works by, like, I know that I'm doing this thing. What does Angular do when I do this?
Is it bad that I don't ever use a debugger?
Oh my gosh, you're just reading code on GitHub?
I also don't do that.
Console log does a lot of the same thing. You just, when you have the AngularJS kind of source code editable in your project, you can just log stuff from inside Angular functions. See what the current arguments of the function are and what it's doing. That helps a lot if you don't use a debugger. That's kind of the similar trick. But I think that it's useful to not just read the source code, but to actually study it in action while it's running.
Yeah.
What's on inside.
Yeah, I agree.
One additional trick I use when I actually want to go deeper into some feature is to find from the Angular GitHub project or from the cloned Git repository the code that you're interested in, and git blame it, because that gives you the last commit that would touch that code somehow. And Angular happens to have this kind of really well-maintained Git history. It has the best I've ever seen. Like, every commit in the Angular Git repository, it explains what went in there and why it went in there, and furthermore, it has links to GitHub issues and pull requests that were closed by that commit. So when you git blame something, you find the last commit that touched it, you follow the links to GitHub, you find usually there's this big discussion about why this commit was made, like what were the reasons this code was ended up like it did, and what other alternatives were there. And usually there's like real gems, like comments from the core team there that explain like why this thing is like. Really want to understand not only how something works, but why it works like that. In GitHub issues in Angular, there's a huge amount of information about that.
Awesome. So maybe you can take us just down the skeletal closet of Angular, and like from your exploratory experience in Angular source code, what would you say are the best parts of the code base, like the most impressive and elegant, and what are the worst parts, like the most scary and nightmarish?
Well, the best, I would say, probably is the digest, just because it's, it was so magical until you actually read, and it isn't that magical or even that complicated compared to many of the other things. And it really adds value when you learn that, because that helps you understand its performance characteristics so much better. Like what takes time and memory and what doesn't, when you know how it works. And the code there isn't hugely complicated. There are things like promises that have the same kind of characteristic that they are sort of, you don't really understand how they work until you actually explore the source code of promises. And that's a similar piece of the framework in that it's not huge and it's not hugely complicated. As to the worst, probably, well, compile.js would be it, because I've spent 10 months on it, learning it now. I'm still not quite done. And it has this, we all know from the API that it obviously wasn't designed like that. Things were added over the years, a little bit by bit, like this flag and that flag. And there's never been like an overhaul of that thing until now with Angular 2. And that exact same thing you can see from the implementation, like there's these nested functions and these kind of, well, just branches in that code. The branching factor is very large. There's just not only a large amount of code, but it's also complicated code. And that I would say is, well, you could say it's the worst, but it's at least the most complex and difficult to grasp.
So you've mentioned the digest cycle. Now that you really understand what's going on there, not only theoretically but also really as you read the source code. Do you have any tips on, like, any performance tips that we don't see in the interwebs currently? Like something more than just keep the watchers down or low, or I don't know.
Probably not like hugely spectacular things like that. Those things that people say about it anyway get reinforced when you learn it. Like using deep watching is expensive, not only because of the data structure walking that needs to happen, but because of the copy memory that Angular needs to keep of your data when you use deep watches. The same with collections, only on but they do it only on one level. And it's really things like that. There's this one trick, I don't think I've ever really used it, but I've mentioned it to a few people, which is when you call digest as opposed to apply. That can be a little bit faster, because apply always goes to the root scope and runs all the watches in your whole application. But digest only starts from the scope that you call it on and goes down from there. It doesn't go to any other siblings or parents. That's some kind of micro optimization that you can apply when you know what you're doing. But to be honest, I don't remember actually using it.
And can you also say something on the track by feature in the ng repeat syntax? Why is using track by such a big improvement for performance?
I don't know. I don't.
Okay.
I haven't written about ng repeat, so I haven't studied it.
I think, unless somebody else has some comments on this, if I understand it correctly, track by just tells Angular how to check equality of items in the array, and so by default, I can't remember. I believe that by default it'll check do a deep watch on each item if it's like you're iterating over an array of objects, and so it has to do a deep equals on each one of those objects to make sure that it's equal. But if you do a track by, like if you have a list of users, then you say track by user.id, and then it just does equality on those IDs. Or if it's like, if you can verify that you're never going to change the order of these items, you could do track by $index, and that would be like just like super fast as well. But yeah, I think most of us have seen. There's a post, maybe we should link to it, about how React.js is super fast, that's for sure. But there is one particular example that has been used to demonstrate how slow Angular is in comparison to React. And in that example, they weren't using track by. And like that's an easy thing to miss if you're not really familiar with the framework. But by using track by, it like sped up the Angular example, like so you could almost not even notice a difference. But it made it like super fast. So Olivia, you posted a link in our comments. Could you post a link to the Hangout so people can go take a look? That was a good, interesting post. So
yeah. Also, the track by helps out too when you go get new data, right? So if you're tracking by the ID, let's say you go to the server and you come back, Angular knows, like you come back with a server with the same data set with just a few additions. Angular knows the elements that are already in that list and don't have to create them again and update the DOM, so that saves on performance as well.
That makes sense. Cool, thanks.
That DOM, man. Cool. So let's shift over to Angular 2. So I know that Pascal's actually got quite a bit of experience with Angular 2, right? And I've done a little bit with it, but Tero, you said at the beginning of the show that you, or before we started, that you've delved into the source a little bit. What can you tell us about differences and improvements?
A little bit, yes. I haven't gone that deep into it yet, but there are a couple of things that kind of jump out immediately when you try to see a little bit what's going on in there. And the first is sort of more obvious, and that's it's written in TypeScript, as we know. And whatever you may think of TypeScript, it's undeniable that when you're reading the source code, it's a big help to have type declarations in that code, especially in function declarations. Like looking at a function declaration, you can see immediately from the first line what are its arguments, types of its arguments, and what does it return. That's like a huge thing where you can probably skip reading the rest of the function if you can sort of figure it out from that alone. This doesn't happen with Angular 1 or in pretty much any JavaScript code, really. You have to, if you want to know what type an argument to a function is, you kind of have to look at the function implementation and see what it's doing with it. Does it call a method on it, or what does it compare it to, or what is it really? And that happens a lot with Angular 1 source code with me, although the documentation is pretty good for the external facing functions, but you don't have it really for the internal functions. And also, since it's dynamically typed, people often do take kind of advantage of that and have return values that are different in different cases, so functions that sometimes return objects and sometimes return functions or whatever, and that having to write your type declarations like you do in TypeScript kind of immediately points out to you that that's probably a bad idea, and people don't do that. And that's one thing. The second thing about the Angular 2 code base, to me, it just more obviously feels like it's designed. Like the Angular 1 code base is something that looks like something that's grown into what it is today. Like it started from something very small all those years ago, and things have been added to it, to some parts more elegantly than to others, until it is the thing that it is now. But again, returning to compile.js, it's obviously wasn't designed to be the thing that it is now. When you look at the compilation code in Angular 2, it's this kind of collection of tens of different classes that have different roles and responsibilities in the compilation system that do certain well-defined things. Like there's this whole thing of object-oriented design that has obviously gone into Angular 2. And there's no afterthoughts in that design, at least not yet. And everything that's there seems to be there for a purpose. And that really helps in learning it, although it might not be that good for book authors like me.
Nice. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Pascal.
Do you think that like rewriting the Angular 1 source code in ES6 or even TypeScript would help out then? I mean, because then you also would have types and classes and everything. So if that makes the code easier to understand, then maybe this is something that should be done. Because so when we like a lot of people don't like Angular 2 because they see the new syntax, they see TypeScript, they see ES6 classes, and then they are like, oh my gosh, what's going on there? But it turns out that you can write your Angular 1 code today with almost the same syntax, right? You can use ES6, you can use TypeScript. There are even projects that lets you use ES7 decorators in Angular 1. And then you can basically write your Angular 1 application in a way that it looks like Angular 2 code, but it isn't. So it's really just syntax in the end. So I wonder if, actually, maybe it should help if Angular 1 is also slowly moving to something like ES6 or TypeScript. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't really thought about it, but I think, yeah, adding type signatures to where it's possible would probably do no harm, at least. Would probably be actually very useful. I mean, at least as an exercise, if not into the production code base. Right? Why not? Because it only helps. As to some of the other things in ES6, like classes, that may be a bit more difficult since the code base is not really class-oriented at all in Angular 1. At least that's not how I see it, and it would be difficult to retrofit some of the class-oriented features of ES6 into it without affecting the API, which you, with Angular 1 you can't break. But types, yeah, it's a very interesting thought.
Yeah, actually, so with Angular 1, like I've noticed, if you just look at a file, you'll see random like global functions that they're calling here and there. Like at least when you first look at it, you think it's random. You're just like, well, where did that for each come from? And like they have a ton of utility functions that they use throughout the code base that are actually, like, it's not going to be global when you actually use the Angular.js file, but like as part of their build, they expose these global functions inside of their own code, which I think probably makes maintaining that code base a lot more difficult, as well as having like a 1,000-line compile.js file just in it of itself. Like, and as you said, like it didn't start out that way, but suddenly somebody needs this, or they find this weird bug or edge case, and you make an if statement, and and there you go. So
yeah, it's evidently kind of also written before any sane module system existed. Like it's all concatenated into this one function closure inside which they have essentially globals internally for the framework that you can call from any file in Angular but are not exposed. But yeah, you end up grepping for things when you try to find where something is defined.
But don't let that stop you, people listening and watching, from contributing to Angular. It's actually not like crazy difficult, and it's really rewarding. So do it. And we actually have an episode on contributing to Angular, so go check that out if you're curious.
The thing about Angular is that you don't have to understand everything about it to contribute on something, because it is, although it's kind of grown into the thing that it wasn't supposed to be, and it isn't really as bad as it may sound based on that. Like it isn't, the quality isn't that bad in that code base, like comparing to the most of the code I've written, for example, during my career. Like it's all relative.
All right, awesome. So I think it's coming about time we should probably get into Q&A and picks and tips. So does anybody else have questions that they wanted to ask before we move on?
Well, I had two listed in the doc, but I don't know if you have time.
You can go ahead and ask those. I think that might be pretty quick.
So you said that with Angular 1 you started with scope. Where would you start if you had to write a book on Angular 2?
That's a good question. I would probably have to write a couple of applications before I really felt like what would I want to figure out first. But to me, it probably feels like I would start with something that doesn't exist in Angular 1 or is very different in Angular 1. And that something might be zones, for example, because that's kind of a low-level utility that many things depend on, but it doesn't itself depend on many other things, and a little bit does feel like magic when you look at what it does. So that's probably not a bad starting point.
Yeah, actually, if you start your book on this one, I will read it because I really want to know how it works.
Yeah, me too.
I think Tero first has to clone himself in order to get this.
Right.
Done.
Yeah,
Well,
it'll be a while before the Build Your Own kind of book will surface for Angular 2, because it's the kind of book that only is useful when people have kind of written a few applications, and it also requires a relatively stable code base. Like, you don't want to be rewriting chapters all the time, which we would have to do right now with Angular 2. But maybe someday, yeah.
Right, and that will come with the Taro 2.0 too, right? So, just
Right.
kidding.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we'll be maintaining Taro 1.4 for a little while too. So. Just kidding. Okay, I went too far there, I think. So, okay, let's go ahead and get into the Q&A. We do have one question. This is from our ever so faithful Jeff Welpley. He says, you obviously know Angular 1 inside and out. Have you looked into 2.0 internals? We kind of talked about that. And then he asks, will you have a 2.0 version of your NG Vegas talk? Which we should probably link. I'll go search for that while you're answering.
Yeah, maybe at some point. I touched on this earlier, which is that the Angular 2 source code happens to be a lot easier to pick up, which means that it might not need that kind of talk as much as Angular 1 does, because it's easier to learn it. But yeah, why not? I was kind of planning at some point to write a sort of what happens inside the Angular 2 directive compiler article, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. And one of the reasons was that between two weeks when I started looking at it for the first time and the second time, it had changed quite a bit. So it seems a bit early to go into the internals of Angular 2 at this point, because they're changing quite a bit.
One rugs out under your feet as you go. That'd be fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, that'd be a good talk, I think. So in the future. All right. Let me just make sure. I think we've got all of our questions. Yeah. If anybody else watching has questions, ask them now. I'll keep the Q&A up so that we find them. But I think we're going to go into picks and tips. So let's start with Amy. Do you have picks and tips for us?
I have a pick. It's been a pretty popular article, but it's an article on promises, and it just proposes like 4 different scenarios and asks that you ask whether or not you understand how the 4 different promises work, and then it just slowly goes through, like walks you through why they're all different, the right way to do it. So maybe people have read this already, but if you haven't, it's definitely worth checking out. So that is my pick. Programming related, I was also on vacation last week, so I was going to pick like a non-programming related thing, which is like good Southern barbecue cooking. So I have a pick to a restaurant if you're ever like in the South or something. It's a really good barbecue restaurant. So that's my fun pick, and that's it.
Great, thanks. Olivier.
So I was gonna talk about the React versus Angular, but you mentioned it already. And also, I wanted to promote readme.io. We talked about it in another episode. It's a really cool website if you have to write documentation, and it's free for open source. So please write good documentation, and you can use this. And my fun pick is if you have the time, try The Witcher 3, because it's like one of the best games these days. So enjoy.
I agree.
Is that a double pick, Pascal?
Pretty much, yeah. Because actually, that's perfect because I don't have any picks really. Well, there's one thing. Polymer 1.0 has been announced at Google I/O, and I haven't checked it out yet, but I think everybody should. So that's my pick.
Awesome. And I forgot to remember, or I think I forgot to remind everybody, make sure you put links to your picks in the Hangout if links make sense, so people can go see them. I'll go ahead, and then Tero, you can go. So my picks are, I have 3. My first pick is Tero's talk at NGNL. It was a fantastic talk. Yeah, actually, 4 of us were there and witnessed the awesomeness of this talk. So yeah, go check that out. I'll link to that. It's called Inside the Angular Directive.
I already linked.
You you linked it already? Oh man. Well, I'm gonna link it anyway. Ha! No, just kidding. So my next pick is iwantmyname.com. They have excellent support. I just did sorry, they're a domain registrar. I think they're in Australia, but they're fantastic. Very, very good service. Yeah, so that's where I host all of my or do all my domain registration. And I just had a problem, and they answered my question like super fast. Really good support. So they're good. iwantmyname.com. And then my last pick is mostly programming related, I guess, but also happiness. So emoji in comments or in commits is just a fun thing to do. So as you're making your Git commits, I have a link to some ASCII emojicons, which are really awesome, emojicons.com. And then like using actual emoji, like the smiley face and stuff, is also fun. So do that, and people will enjoy your commits. And disapprovallook.com, Olivier just sent that to me. That's also a good one. So those are my picks. Tero.
Yeah, so I have 2 picks. The first one is a programming pick, which is David Nolan, the maintainer of ClojureScript. It goes by the Twitter handle SwanOdet. He has a bunch of really interesting talks online about front-end architecture and what he's doing with ClojureScript and immutable data structures and React. And those are like really, it's a very different approach to handling state and change in front-end applications, and it's really mind-bending stuff if you kind of want to expose yourself to new kinds of ways to do things in the front end. He has been recently, based on his tweets, exploring how to connect that with the Facebook Relay and Netflix JSON graph. So, and I think he's giving a talk about that in a few weeks in Euroclosure. So I'll be looking into that when it comes out. My second pick is a music pick. There's a new album out by Jamie XX, I think just this week, called In Color. It's if you're into electronic music or really any electronic music that has come out in the last 20 years, especially from the UK, you'll probably enjoy this because it's a very it's an album that's very aware of its roots, and it's a very kind of, for anyone who's enjoyed kind of the rave culture and things that have gone on in that culture in the past decades, will like that. And yeah, I do have a tip as well, which has to do with transclusion. I've been studying that for the past few weeks, and one of the things I have learned about that is that inside the transclude option in directives, there are actually 2 completely different features hidden in that. There's the kind of normal transclusion that you enable with transclude true, which gives you the option of including parts of one template in another template, which is usually what we mean by transclusion. But there's also this other way of using it, which is to use the transclude with the values element, the string element. And that's actually for a completely different purpose. It's not including a template in another, but it's for doing things like ngIf and ngRepeat, where you actually need to control when linking happens and how many times linking happens for a certain directive. You basically can defer the linking of a certain element, which is what ngIf does, or do it for a number of clones of that element, which is what ngRepeat does. And that's enabled by the transclude element option. And there's a great comment that explained this by Caitlin Potter on the Angular GitHub, which I'll link to, which I never understood what this actually was for before I read that comment. And that was a great bit of learning that happened for me in the past couple of weeks.
Wow, that's awesome. Caitlin Potter, we need to have her on the show. She is really, really smart. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so I think that's it. We didn't get any other questions, so I'll just close with a couple announcements, and then we can say goodbye. So tune in for our next show next week, same time, same place, June 9th, with Jonathan Turner on Angular with TypeScript. And we may have a TypeScript developer on the show as well, but Jonathan is the lead on that project, and he gave an awesome ng-conf talk recently about that. And then, again, as always, at AngularAir is our Twitter, and follow us for updates, and then our website, angular-air.com. And, yeah. Stickers. Olivia wants stickers. He just chatted to me, so we will have stickers eventually, so follow us to keep up to date with that. So without any further ado, I think we'll just say goodbye. So goodbye, everybody. Thanks.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.